Ladies and gentlemen, let's start with this last panel before lunch. And our panel is on DPIA, Data Protection Impact Assessment. Probably all of you know Article 35, 36 of the GDPR, and that's what we are focusing on. I assume that most of you have read also the guidelines of the Article 29 Working Party, which have been revised in October. We all know that there are also many methodologies that have been published by several supervisory authorities, ICO, CNIL in Germany, Spain, and probably I forget some. More than 50 templates, checklists, etc., that have been published by various law firms, consultants, business organizations, etc. Before we start, I would like to ask you, who among you has been involved in a DPIA in practice already? Okay, a few people. Hi, Stewart. Our panel will focus on a number of specific questions. The questions that have been submitted to us are how and when to carry out a DPIA, which are the best practices, that's the second question, and then also a very delicate question, when and why should data controllers make their DPIA public? I will, without further ado, present our speakers and our moderator. Our moderator, perhaps first, is Dr. Michael Friedewald. He's the coordinator ICT research in the Competence Center Emerging Technologies of the Fraunhofer Institute, ISI in Karlsruhe. He is also the co-editor of an interesting book, which has been published in open data. You can find it on the Taylor and Francis online website. So Michael will moderate the debate, but first we will have 4 presentations, no slides, but let's say 4 short statements. The first one is from Antoine, who is a legal advisor of the Belgian Data Protection Authority. Formerly, he has been working with the EDPS, also the New York Attorney General Office, UN Global Pulse, and CLIP. Then our second speaker will be Paul Breitbarth, who is working for Nymity and currently serves as the Director of Strategic Research and Regulator Outreach there. He is a visiting fellow at Maastricht University, and before joining Nymity, he served as Senior International Officer at the Dutch Data Protection Authority. Okay, then we have Ioana Cristina Cotoi, who is working as a lawyer in Ingegneria Informatica, research and innovation labs, security programs in Italy. And our last statement will be from Paolo Sinibaldi, who is an Italian lawyer, currently since 2016 working as the DPO of the European Investment Fund, which is an EU body based in Luxembourg, and with the mission to enhance SMEs' access to finance. So I will immediately, without further ado, give the floor to Antoine for first intervention. You have only 2 micros. It's also important for the discussion afterwards, because when you want to participate in the discussion, we will ask you to step forward, because you have to use our microphones.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Jos, and thanks to Yunshin for organizing the panel. I was thinking I'm going to try to stick to the questions and the strict 8 minutes that we were allowed. So first I was thinking of setting the scene and giving you some very factual elements on DPIAs. So I was thinking of first talking about when to carry out a DPIA, then how, and then I'll discuss the publicity of the DPIA. So first, the when. Obviously, you have to carry a DPIA in one of the mandatory cases of Article 35.3. Not going to dwell too much on those as they're pretty straightforward. You have to carry a DPIA when there's a high risk, obviously. I'll discuss that. And if the processing is on a list established by a DPA. So about the high risk criteria, I first wanted to stress something. The GDPR says that you have to carry out a DPIA when it's likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals. And what is important to remember is that it's not only the data protection and privacy rights, but also all other fundamental rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, so you have to take that into account also. I say that it might be very obvious for some of you, but that's something that struck me when I read the Working Party paper. About that, the Working Party 29 paper, which is the Working Paper 248, sets 9 criteria to know if you're in a case of high risk. Among those criteria, you have to determine if your process is of a large scale. You have to determine if it involves sensitive data, if you monitor vulnerable subjects, if you use new technologies. So there are 9 criteria, and the working paper says that basically most of the time, if you meet 2 of those criteria, you should conduct a DPIA. It also says, and it's a bit confusing maybe, that if you only meet 1 of those criteria, in certain cases, you still have to conduct a DPIA. So I'll come back on that maybe obstacle or difficulty a bit later. And I'm gonna discuss now the list established by the DPAs. So the Belgian Privacy Commission recently released a recommendation, which is on our website. It's open for public consultation until the end of February. And in this recommendation, we repeat a lot of what the working group 29 said before, but we also have 2 annexes. The annex number 2 lists a number of processing which require a DPIA. And the annex number 3, all the processings, some processing which do not require a DPIA, which is quite interesting. And in that second list, you can find processing such as necessary to process employees' salaries, the administration of employment information, but also things like just the information that the processing made for security checks at the entrance of an office. Something that I like to underline is that it's really important to understand that it's not because a processing that you carry corresponds to a processing that is on the list of the processing. Sorry, I'm saying processing too many times. But it's not because it's on the list of the processing which do not require a DPIA that it won't require a DPIA. Basically, the bottom line is that you always have, it's a guideline, it's a guidance, but you always have to think about the specificities of your processing. I'm not going to say that it's on a case-by-case basis, but you have to take into account the specific circumstances of your own processing. That's something that I really want to stress. You shouldn't stick to those lists and say, my processing is the same, I don't have to carry a DPIA. So that's a point I wanted to make. Obviously, if you have a doubt, should I carry a DPIA or not? We would recommend, if you have a doubt, carry a DPIA. But if you still don't want to carry a DPIA, obviously document the reasons why, and if you have a DPO, include his views. That's always helpful. The how, I don't know if if I still have a bit of time, but so basically the GDPR doesn't prescribe any specific method to carry a DPIA. There's a free choice for the controllers. as long as it's reliable and objective, and it has to contain a certain numbers of elements that are included in 35.7. It's also up to the controller to choose a methodology as long as it's compliant to the Annex 2 of the Working Party 29 document. The Working Party 29 and the Belgian Privacy Commission recommend to use already existing methodology such as the ISO standards. For those who are interested, it's the 31,000, the risk management, and the 27.5 on information security risk management. And about the public disclosure, so disclosing your DPIA is not a legal requirement, although we strongly encourage controllers to do so because it's a helpful tool for them, but also for consumers, citizens, and regulators. We don't, something that seems to be complicated to understand for controllers, that we don't ask businesses to reveal all their trade secrets and confidential information. So what we would advise is that they publish a summary of their DPIAs. And yeah, that's it for me. Thanks.
Thanks, Antoine. I will give the floor to Michael.
Let's give them all after. Okay, I would suggest we give the presentation all after first and then end this.
Okay, then I give the floor to Paul.
Thank you very much. I'll use this
have.
one, and you can keep that microphone on your end. Good afternoon, everybody. Indeed, Paul Breitbarth. I work for Nymity. We are a Canadian privacy research and software developer, and have spent the past year doing a lot of work on data protection impact assessments. And one of the things we started with, being a Canadian company, privacy impact assessments and data protection impact assessments are nothing new. Especially in Canada, they've been around since the 1970s. They have been mandatory in many situations in North America since the 1980s. But the principles and the methodology haven't fundamentally changed ever since. It's a long questionnaire that's being drawn up by the Privacy Office and maybe some other lawyers and compliance officers in an organization that is then sent out to the business with the request to answer as many questions as soon as possible. The business considers this to be a tedious exercise, doesn't like it, is reluctant to fill out as many information as they can because they think it is only intended to restrain their innovation. And then you get lengthy meetings trying to decide what still needs to be assessed and how to mitigate the risk, should any risk at any time occur. Lengthy processes, not very popular, so we saw that there was room for improvement. And especially with the GDPR in mind, we went looking for that improvement, and we believe that we've come up with something new, a bit different, which still achieves the same purpose, risk identification and risk mitigation, that could fall under the scope of what also the Working Party 29 and the GDPR calls a data protection impact assessment. We've called that an accountability PIA, and there is a paper on our website. I won't go through the full paper today, but I will take some highlights as a possible methodology to do a DPIA, and that is also one of the questions up for discussion here today. I will also cover the other two, by the way. But what we actually do is try to make the process a bit more flexible. Because one of the requirements in the Working Party Opinion 248 is not only that you do complete a DPIA for high-risk processing operations, but also that you should review your DPIAs on a regular basis and make sure that they are kept up to date. Like all your accountability requirements under the GDPR, it has to be reviewed regularly, updated where necessary. And especially in this day and age of agile programming, of agile development in more and more organizations, it is very difficult to decide at the outset what it is that your project will aim to achieve, or the framework of your project may change along the way, which also impacts your data protection and privacy impact assessments. So that is one of the reasons why we decided to come up with this. And what we're actually doing is building upon the Article 30 processing activities register. Because if you look at the two provisions, what it is you need to assess whether or not you have a high-risk processing operation under Article 35, and what it is you need to register in your Article 30 processing activities register, it's more or less the same data. What type of data are you using? What purposes are you collecting the data and using the data for? Where is the data processed, etc. So that information, which you already have in your processing activities register, if you have completed that, can also be used to assess whether or not you have a high-risk processing at hand or not, following the guidelines from the data protection authorities, both at European and at national level. And of course, you need to take a close look at those national black and white lists. For example, in Slovenia, the Slovenian DPA has decided that everything to do with drones is always to be considered as a high-risk processing operation. So in those cases, you need to complete your DPIA. So when you have that basic data and you start looking at it, analyzing, does this indeed lead to a high-risk processing operation, you can already see, okay, I do indeed need that DPIA. I need to identify what risks to the rights and freedom of individuals are associated to this project. Typically, that is something that we would say, leave that to the privacy and compliance officers. Don't let the business discuss that, because the privacy officers, they know the legislation, they know the organization, so they should also be in a good position to deal with that. And then look at risk mitigation. And risk mitigation can, of course, still be that theoretical discussion that it always was. But looking at the GDPR and all the accountability requirements, we also believe that you can do that at a project level. So per project, per processing operation, you can identify risk mitigation. And we suggest that organizations do that by leveraging the policies and procedures that they have developed anyway to protect personal data and linking them to the specific project that they are undertaking. So for example, if you are doing a data collection, in any case what you have is your privacy notice explaining what you're going to do to the data subject. You have your policies and procedures to deal with data subject rights, to deal with breach management. All those elements will help to mitigate risk in the longer run. And that might not be the full package that you need, but in any case, every step of those policies and procedures will help you in the risk mitigation effort. And by documenting that at the project level, you can also do effectiveness assessments. First of all, the business can do the effectiveness assessments. Are these policies and procedures indeed what I would like to use when processing these data? Do they actually help me? Are they clear enough? And where not, provide feedback to the privacy office that the internal guidelines need to be improved. The privacy office can use them to review whether they see that the business is using enough of the policy and procedures or that there are missing things. And then finally, you can also use the audit department or an external auditor to review those processes and see whether they consider the mitigation to be effective. So at 3 levels, you could use that. And we think that is a very effective way to deal with risk mitigation. Then on the question, should you publish a DPIA, yes or no? And there I agree a lot with Antoine. It is a sign of strength for responsible organizations to be as transparent as possible, including on what risks they see in their data processing, but also on what benefits they see of their processing. So the 2 sides of the coin. Be clear about what you are doing, what effect that has on the data subject, positive and negative, and how you are trying to improve that situation, how to protect that personal data. And yes, I also agree that you don't need to publish the full DPIA report, because that will obviously contain business confidential information, might even make you vulnerable. If you show how you mitigate risk in technical ways, then hackers might be able to find out from that as well how they could attack you, because the things that you are not doing. But a summary version of a DPIA report would be very welcome if organizations would indeed start to publish that. And there I would say that the more risky the processing operation is, the higher the need for risk mitigation, but also the higher the risk for transparency. I'll leave it at that for my introduction.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Our next statement comes from Ioana.
Yes. Hello, everyone. So the concept of privacy impact assessment or data protection impact assessment, the way it was renamed under the GDPR, emerged more than 30 years ago, as Paul already mentioned. A lot of progress was done during all this period, still maintaining its main known approach. But even yesterday I was in another panel, there were people talking about data impact assessment, so taking into account not only data protection but also ethics implications, societal implications. So there are a lot of flavors of this done, but still going back to data protection impact assessment, which is mandatory the fact that GDPR includes it in Article 35 gives even more impetus to this practice. Recital 74 states ambiguously that measures of controllers should take into account the risk to the rights and freedoms of natural people. Chapter 4 regarding the obligations of processors and controllers mentioned several times concepts like risk, high risk, risk assessment, without actually, of course, defining these concepts. And again, Article 35 is quite ambiguous in this sense. So of course this leads to a lot of questions from organizations in when to do it, how to do it, like actually what we are discussing today here. But I would say that I think that this broad concept should be seen as a great advantage in the first place, because allows organizations to enable a flexible and context-specific approach to our compliance, allows them to prioritize tasks and allocate their resources effectively, while of course protecting the rights of individuals. And this is quite important. So any guidance on the risk process or methodology must be principle-based and high-level and flexible, to leaving it to the organizations and also to industry sector to develop their own processes and to adopt. That can also, which is very important, can be integrated in their broader organizational risk management programs, because data protection impact assessment is a risk assessment, but compared to the others, to the general ones, which focuses on organizational assets, this one focuses on individual rights and freedoms. So, but in the end, the organization will have to put everything into one unique solution, let's say. Well, in terms of methodologies, my colleagues already said that there were a lot of things done so far, that the protection authorities released in the last years a lot of guidelines, papers, templates. There is also something done on the on specific sectors, which of course are very good, and for sure in the next period I expect more templates like this to be published. So in any case, independently on the methodology that one decides to adopt, for sure there are the minimum features that have to be included, that are exposed in detailed in Article 35, and I'm not going to go to read them. What I think that it's also very important in assessing the risk, it's also should be taken into consideration the benefits of processing, benefits not related necessarily to the organization, which those are quite obvious, but the benefits to individuals, to society in general, and to the other stakeholders, in order to enable the preservation of the desired benefits when implementing any necessary mitigations to address that identified risks. Also, I believe that having in mind the benefits would impact the way the risks are evaluated, because same risk may be scored differently when compared to low benefit or to high benefit. Now, it is clear that mitigation does not mean complete elimination of the risk, but it means reducing and or minimizing the risk to the greatest reasonable extent, given the desired benefits and economical or technological parameters. So in the end, the organization will be left with some residual risks, and we'll have to decide whether to proceed with the processing in light to that risk. In making this decision, the issue of proportionality regarding purposes, interests, and or benefits will have to come into play. Now, moving to when it should be done, Bon already said, Working Party 29 in its guidelines defines those 9 criteria, I believe. and they are already a good starting point in understanding what high risk could mean. In the same time, the specific lists that data protection authorities will eventually publish, I mean in Italy at least they did not publish anything, it will be of a great help. And not only defining the high-risk processing operations, but also probably the low-risk processing that by default do not require data protection impact assessment. So now I agree with Bon saying that it should be a case-by-case analysis, and it falls under the accountability concept. But in the same time, we still need to define some boundaries and some grounds in order to understand when and if organization has to perform an impact assessment. So far, this is from my side.
Okay, thanks. Then we have, last but not least, Paolo Sinibaldi.
Yes, good morning. I'm working as a DPO at the European Investment Fund. So my intention is to share with you some, I would say, operational remarks from the battlefield in the daily life of the DPO. So that's why I would like to complement the previous presentation about on the how and the when with the who. So you may wonder why about the who. In principle, it should be clear. It's up to the controller. Well, at least my personal experience is not so easy to define. The DPO should be acting as advisor. But then when we start discussing about, for instance, highly sophisticated risks, which could be algorithms to be used for automated decisions. So I just want to share my personal experience. So I'm a lawyer with no very specific IT knowledge. So if I have, actually when I have to sit down with my controller, then first, second, we need to, so this is the initial stakeholder. Then we have a second stakeholder, which could be, in my case, at the group level. So EIF is part of the European Investment Bank group. And IT services are shared services, which means I cannot carry out a standalone DPIA, must be seen and accepted in the context of broader environment, governance and political environment. So my second stakeholder is the group, the IT group, and EIB DPO. And third, last but not least, when we speak about, for instance, algorithms, I was saying before, we have to get back and understand, or even for the cloud, sorry, what is the service provider, and it is the only contractor or there are subcontractors. So when time comes to start discussing and putting black on white, what are the inherent risks, what are the mitigants, and what are the residual risks, I personally may struggle a bit to cope with highly IT wording, highly IT concept, and something which is out of my knowledge. So that's why I envisage a stronger and stronger cooperation in the same enterprise, in this case, in the same environment, between different stakeholders, different actors. And last but not least, as far as the last point, the transparency is, the publication is concerned, the EIF is an EU body, so and as such is committed to have the best-in-class program as far as transparency is concerned. So so far, no DPIA has been completed. We're still work in progress, just on the cloud. And but I think I will leave the senior management to decide. But in principle, I foresee the likelihood that we will be publishing the whole DPIA just for transparency purposes. So once again, my colleagues discuss about the how, the when, and about the who. I still struggle sometimes to see if it's only with the controller or controller plus DPO or controller plus DPO plus other stakeholders. Thank you.
Okay, I will then give the floor to the moderator.
Thank you, Jos. I think before opening the floor to audience questions, I have a question for each of the speakers. Antoine, you mentioned the whitelist and the blacklist and the uncertainty about the different criteria mentioned in the Working Party 29 guidance paper. On the other hand, it was mentioned that DPIAs is not only about legal risks, but concerned about all kinds of freedom, rights and freedoms of the data subject. Do you think that this exercise will in the end focus on the more legal side, or is there a tendency or a need to go beyond that, as for instance discussed yesterday in the ethical impact assessment session?
All right. Yeah, thanks for your question. I'm all in for ethic. I think ethic is a really fantastic concept, although it's not a requirement of Article 35. So I might be a bit obtuse, I guess, but it's DPIAs. If your DPIAs is ethic, it's really great, good for you. But if it doesn't have the legal requirements, you might get fined, or you might be sanctioned. So if your DPIA is compliant and ethic, I would say kudos. Really, that's the best. But it's not about it. It's about legal risks. We're not discussing. It's not about. I don't know. I don't even know what ethic means. I'm not a philosopher, and even philosophers don't know about ethics. So, yeah.
Maybe I can make that more precise. So for instance, obviously one of the risks is the risk of discrimination, which is not really enshrined in the core of what I've heard about DPIA discussions, which nevertheless is one of the rights and freedoms of the data subject that might be at risk.
I mean, obviously, it's a difficult balance to strike, but again, DPIA is an accountability tool. So when you process data, you also have responsibilities coming with that. And I mean, I'm gonna say if you think that your processing might be discriminatory, it probably is, So it's never a good thing to ask yourself those questions. I mean, it's better not to ask yourself those questions, definitely. But if you start erring on that side, you should take as much precautions as you can, and you should put as many safeguards as you can. So, I mean, it's not specific to data protection or to DPIAs. Businesses, controllers, they always have to balance and mitigate risks. So it's not something that's really specific to DPIAs or data protection or privacy.
Okay, thank you. Paul, you mentioned the involvement of the shop floor level for doing the assessment and risk mitigation. So that, and we also heard about the closeness of maybe the DPIA processes and some already established risk management in companies. Nevertheless, of course, they have very different goals. Do you see it as an advantage, or is it a risk to be too close to risk management, which has the company assets in focus and not the data subject?
No, for me it would be a best practice to try and involve as many people as possible when you are assessing your data processing operations. Like Paolo also said, a DPO doesn't know everything. If we look at the DPO requirements in the GDPR, at best we are looking at, as we say it in Dutch, a 5-legged sheep. But in theory, it might even be a 7-legged sheep, somebody who needs to be everywhere, or a spider, everywhere in the organization have its tentacles and be able to know what's going on. That is almost impossible for DPO to understand and know everything that is going on. So you will need to work in multidisciplinary teams, have the help of parts of the organization. And that is why we indeed advocate that if you have any possibility at all to try and involve business, the work floor, when identifying your processing operations, but also when identifying possible mitigation options. And in any organization with the GDPR in hand, what you will need to do is make sure that your employees understand what the requirements are and what your internal policies and procedures are. So that is something that organizations will train their staff on to, in any case, raise awareness of what is going on in privacy and data protection after the 25th of May. It's a very good practice, but it's also one of those requirements in the GDPR. And that will also help them to understand what it is that they need to do, at least in my conviction. Maybe if you allow me just to get back to the ethics part, ethical data processing is, of course, also part of the general principles, the fairness of the processing, which is an integral element of your description of any processing operation, whether that is when you are looking at your processing operation for your register, but also the impact assessment. Fairness is one of those principles that should be weighed when you are doing your risk mitigation.
Maybe I continue that question first with a question for Paolo, because you also made the point about the involvement of different stakeholders within companies. But Article 35 also says that, well, if necessary, you should consult the affected groups. I haven't heard anything about that from the panel. Do you have a view on how useful it is or how feasible it is to involve affected groups?
Difficult question, especially about the feasibility. To be honest, I don't know. I wouldn't know how to address this kind of need. Such considering the EF broad audience all over Europe would be extremely difficult to address. But following up also on what Paul said before, what we are envisaging at EF is the GDPR will trigger, actually, as a real triggered, a cultural shift. Mm-hmm. Not a shift of responsibilities, because as we said on paper, it's up to the controller to carry out the DPIA, but a cultural shift because the DPO, considering the reasonable size of DF 500 employees, more or less, we do believe that will be less and less, I would say, a diligent farmer as used to be before, so keeping care of the inventory of records, of the proper notifications, timely notifications, and more shifting to a proactive hunter. So what I'm trying to do is to chase the controllers through the questionnaire that we already received in draft version from EDPS about the when. So when certain processing operations require DPIA. So I circulated the questionnaire all across the institution. And then now is the phase B. So I'm chasing the controllers. So we sit together down. They explain me what they wrote. And the same structure of the Article 29 Working Party. For more, the two or more, yes, if you tick the box, a DPIA is required. So again, rather a hunting mood than a waiting position. This is at the moment my interpretation.
That sounds good. It sounds as if DPIA could be the first step towards a more privacy-friendly organization that makes sure that privacy is not only the job of the legal department, but the responsibility of well, practically everyone in the company, in the organization.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Ioana, you mentioned when it came to the different schemes that are used to do the assessment, that in the end you use well the scheme that is at hand in a different country. We also heard about the new ISO IEC 234 or something. It sounds a little bit like the new fragmentation of Europe in terms of the DPIA. Do you expect some kind of synergy of convergence towards a pan-European standard in that respect?
Yes, hopefully. I mean, already the fact that Working Party 29 released these guidelines defines some general concepts, defines the how to perform it, the criteria. So what they did is trying to uniformize a bit the approach in all Europe. Then, of course, data protection authorities already released, and there are some releasing different methodologies. But I don't think there is a good one, a perfect one, one to adopt. But I think, as I was saying, that organizations should actually analyze the best, the ones that are available, and choose the one that fits for their needs. So I don't think that using different approaches in performing a data protection impact assessment will fragmentize the Europe in this sense. Important is to make it good, to take it into serious, to implement the measures that you're writing that are necessary. And I mean, that's the point, I think, of Article 35 in the end.
Yeah, just wanted to add two things. First thing is on the possibility for data subjects to be involved, which is offered by Article 35(9). I don't think it would be that difficult, you know, because especially in certain areas, for example, if you're an IoT company and you're about to release like, I don't know, something, an assistant or something, or a smartwatch or something like that, you know, obviously before releasing their product, they do tests with consumers that I think all companies do or should do. And it wouldn't be too difficult to imagine that the consumers, the data subject, would also be questioned on the potential privacy risks that this product could cause. So that's something I wanted to add. And also it's clearly beneficial for the company, because I can imagine that if when you release your product, a lot of consumers actually don't buy because they're afraid that it would create privacy risks. If you release, I'm just saying that on top of my mind, but if you also release a summary of your DPIA on the box, on the toy, on the watch, on the product, whatever, it's very reassuring, it's very comforting for the consumers, you know. So that I think would be a good use, a good way to involve the data subject. On the second point, on the fragmentation of the criteria, that high-risk criteria, the first thing I wanted to say is that most DPAs, they inspire themselves from the criteria listed in the paper from Article 29. So, I mean, those are those are interpretations, obviously, but they're more or less going towards the same direction. So I don't think there will be a risk of fragmentation. And if this happens, EDPB is there to ensure the coherence of those criteria. So, yeah, I don't think there will be fragmentation, which is a very, very strong word, but yeah, be reassured. It will be coherent.
You would be well, open enough to accept any DPIA conducted by an established scheme in Europe as a Belgian DPIA, because I heard voices from some of the DPAs selling, well, this or that scheme is not really up to our standard, and issues like that.
I don't know. I mean, actually, we would just be very, very dull public servants. We would just take the guidelines from the Working 29 and our own guidelines, which are, again, more or less saying the same things, and we would just, you know, take the GDPR and be good students and just check if the DPIA is compliant to the GDPR. Yeah? Sorry for that very obvious answer.
Well, I must say that the civil servants at most DPAs are not very dull, but are very hard-working people with a lot of humor. So, now just on the point, indeed, will DPAs accept any type of DPIA framework that has been used? I think they should. because there is no prescriptive form in the GDPR. So that means that the burden of proof that they have done it right is on the data controller. And they should be able to convince the DPA that the methodology that they have used is indeed the right one in their situation, and that they have identified the risks to the harms and freedoms of the individual, and that they have done effective risk mitigation. So it is up to the data controllers to show what they have done and why, and not to the DPAs to say, oh no, but we don't like that methodology.
Well, the challenge then is probably to convince the controllers to use the flexibility of the framework, not for a race to the bottom, but for a race to the top.
Yeah, and that is, I think, for all of GDPR, the intention to make it a race to the top, to show the world that Europe has the best data protection standards that are available, but also to show consumers and data subjects in general that data protection is there to help them, and that you as an organization want to leverage data protection as a best practice.
Though it's a tedious exercise.
Though it may be a tedious exercise, but let's not forget when in the 80s the environmental legislation was introduced, everybody thought it was tedious, but by now that is also a best practice and a unique selling point, and that should be the same and will be the same in my conviction for data protection.
Yeah, I have some other remarks from my own experience in the few DPIAs that I've been involved in. My first conclusion is that that the reality in practice is much more complicated. So, for instance, in my case, the DPIAs that I've been involved in, the major ones, were at the level of the processor. And so one of the questions was how to involve data subjects, but also how to involve controllers. So that's one point. The other question that we also receive very often is the relationship between Article 35 and 36. So we understand also from the Article 29 Working Party guideline that the assessment is an iterative process. So you have to, assessment means that you have to look at the risks, but at the same time you have to think about, as Paul mentioned it, you have to see, oh, am I going to mitigate the risks? So what kind of measures, are these measures sufficient, and then reassess, etc. So this circle, you have seen perhaps this scheme in the Article 29 Working Party paper. But then Article 36 says, in the absence of measures, you need prior authorization from the supervisory authority, and that's something that I still have difficulties to understand how this will be done in practice, because of course the controllers and also the processors, they are telling us, well, don't go to the supervisory authority as soon as it becomes possible to go with your report to the DPA, because it's a kind of recognizing that you have not done your homework correctly. You see what I mean. So I will, for the moment, stay with these two remarks, and I don't know, perhaps Antoine or someone else wants to respond.
All right. Yeah, first on your point, how to involve the controller. I mean, the obligation to carry out the DPIA falls on the controller, and I think that if you just show him the fines that he might get if he doesn't do a DPIA if he has to, that should be sufficient to convince him. And if it's not, you should change your controller. Yeah, on the second thing about the residual risk, and when I read the article, I thought it was quite confusing too. But basically, the way I understand it is that if you conduct your DPIAs, you put in place all the safeguards you can think about, and if there's still a high risk, you should come to us, and it's actually nice, I would say, of the DPAs, you know, because you're of good faith and you wanna be compliant, but you don't know how to be compliant, you know, and you fear that your processing might be illegal. So you come to us, and then we have, I think, about is it 8 weeks or something like that to think of solutions. And I think of it as it's a collaborative exercise to basically come together to a way to mitigate the risks. And if by then we didn't find a way to do so, then the processing then won't happen probably. But I don't know. I don't think it would be a smart thing for businesses to kind of hide the possibility of residual risks simply because of the fines and the sanctions they risk.
But maybe that's just a fictitious example, because in the end, when there's a risk of that a processing is forbidden, maybe the controller will say, well, the risk is now manageable.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about accountability, you know. It's if he thinks that the risk is manageable, he should explain why he thinks so, and then it will be up to us to make a decision or to take a decision on that.
In theory, it all sounds very nice, Article 36, but, and maybe it's because I'm Dutch, but I don't really believe in this consultation with the DPA. The Dutch DPA has always taken the stance that prior consultation should be limited as much as possible, because that touches upon the independence of DPAs when they want to start enforcement action. Because once you have given prior approval of a process, you can hardly go back and say, oh no, we're come to enforce after all, because you have already given the green light. But how is the DPA going to know how to mitigate your risks if you, knowing your organization and knowing your project, if you are not able to come up with ideas how to mitigate risk? How is the DPA going to understand what you are doing within 8 weeks and come up with better ideas than what you may have been able to do? I have difficulties believing that this is going to work in practice. Of course, in business interest, I hope it will, but I'll have to see.
Just to make things also a little bit more concrete, in one of the cases that I mentioned, our clients are 42 controllers from 42 different countries, EU and third countries, working with a processor. So it's not even knowing to which supervisory authority you should address you to is not an easy question.
Okay. I think it's time to open the floor to you for your questions, and I think one, Eva, and yeah.
I just want to, hi, I'm Bernard Van Elsen, I'm a colleague of Antoine, and about this concept of prior consultation, well, I think indeed the idea behind it is to keep it limited in the sense of not requiring controllers to actually subject, themselves through an administrative process as they go about their business as a default rule. And so from that perspective, I think the approach focusing on residual risk is real, but this question of like, okay, does that then suggest that I did a bad job, yes or no? I think, not every controller might be aware of the range of risk mitigation strategies, privacy enhancing technologies that might be out there, which they may or may not have considered in their process. So that's an example of where it could be helpful. And there is also indeed this question of this overall balancing at the end in terms of what is the benefit of the processing and the risks being presented. So say, for example, you're in a hospital, you might have an information processing system, might still have high residual risks in some aspects, but without that information management system, that hospital is not going to run. So I mean, there are going to be areas where then you might actually turn to the data protection authority, look at potential additional risk mitigation strategies, but also help you make you sure that this balancing exercise at the end of the DPIA is in fact one which is a sense, or whether you've actually interpreted the risk too much in your own favor.
Hello, everybody. just to shortly introduce myself. I'm a legal researcher at UAD and also concerned with DPIA. And regarding DPAs accepting DPIA methodologies, I think it's important to keep in mind that all the methodologies floating around, not all of them match quite the criteria of the GDPR, for example. Some of them, I've seen quite a lot of different methodologies, and some of them do not even have the fundamental rights perspective at all, and rely more or less on IT security risk mitigation. So I would like to know from you, what is your perspective, what would to look for, what would you advise a DPO of a company also when he's deciding on a methodology?
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, first, the most important guidance is, of course, to follow the guidance from the Article 29 Working Party, because that guidance is not only written as a standard for the DPAs themselves to harmonize their approach, but also to make clear to the business community what it is that is expected. So, of course, if you are going to look what methodology to use, you can use any methodology. I am convinced about that, but make sure that then no matter which methodology you use, you do take into account these suggestions and recommendations from the Working Party. So even if your methodology is IT focused, you can still make sure to adapt it yourself to make sure that all those other elements are included.
Actually, I just want to share our position, which is quite privileged, because as a EU body, we are subject to the supervisory authority of DPS, and so we say we are limited environment, and we have a very strong cooperation with the DPS, which past year already published some draft guidelines as far as DPIA methodology is concerned. So again, I'm speaking about specific remit, but it's a quite privileged position and very, very strict cooperation. So as far as the EU institutions are concerned, institutions, bodies, and agencies, I'm expecting full consistency all across all of them.
More questions?
Any more?
Yeah.
So I'm Stewart Dresner, Chief Executive at Privacy Laws and Business. We publish the world's longest running publication in this field. I think this panel has been really useful talking about the criteria for DPIAs. And my proposal is to develop this work. And my proposal is that I wonder whether anyone here is actually conducting a DPIA. Is anyone working on that at the moment? A few people, yes. Well, what we could do, we'd be happy to write an article about the various efforts you're making. We've heard about the importance of transparency, tell people what you're doing, not revealing commercial confidentiality, of course, but just the main lines of what you're actually doing. We would write the article with your help and then make it available to everyone here who would like to read it. So we would write the article, then publish it, and then send it to everyone who's interested. For that, we would have to volunteers to tell us about your work you're doing in this field, and we need to send it to you. And we have so we need to collect your data with your permission to send this data out, and we need people to volunteer. So is anyone interested to volunteer to share with us what you're doing? We've got one volunteer. Okay, so we'll meet later. And if anyone would like to receive the article, and then we can send it out. Okay, so that's the offer.
I have a question about methodologies. Of course, there is a big list, not an inclusive list of methodologies about DPIAs. It's not possible, but there is a lot of competition about software also and methodologies. In the private sector, it's not a problem. Competition is great in this society, but regarding the public sector, there are some rumors in some countries that public authorities will use one specific software for conducting the DPIAs. What is the opinion of the Privacy Commission about this?
Yeah, I mean, you know more than me about this this topic. I don't think that we would. We're really not competitive between DPAs. I mean, we tried the CNIL tool, which seemed to be really great. We currently don't have developed a tool, but I think overall, and this pertains to DPIAs, but also all other privacy tools that are being developed by DPAs, we have quite a collaborative approach, and we can. I mean, we check what the Dutch DPA does, what the French DPA does, because we don't have the same means as the French DPA, as ICO. So we're really not peculiar about the tools we use, and we're really open about using tools from other DPAs.
My name is Nena Dragicevic. I'm a privacy consultant from the Netherlands. I have one question regarding the difference of the DPIA as stipulated in the GDPR in relation to PIAs which have been used for many years abroad, like in the US or in Canada, as you specified.
I think at this time the difference is very limited, and that is also more or less said in the Working Party Opinion 248. The terminology is used interchangeably for the time being, and I deliberately say for the time being because at Nymity we believe that will change in the next 3 to 5 years, and that a DPIA will be a formal legal obligation under Article 35 in the GDPR in case of high-risk processing. So you need to make that high-risk assessment. Whereas a PIA will continue to be an accountability mechanism, a best practice for all those other situations where you may have risk in your processing, which doesn't amount to the threshold of high risk, but where you still, as a responsible organization, want to do risk mitigation. And I believe that in the coming years, we will see that distinction, and that it might even pick up also outside of the EU. Maybe my scientific friends here on the right have different views.
Can I just answer another question based on that, because it was just mentioned that the DPIA also looks at the fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals. Is this also looked upon abroad, if you know? And the fact that we have to include data subjects' opinions or their involvement, and to argue why their involvement was not, why they were not involved, or why their opinions were not taken into the decision. Is that a practice that happens also outside of EU? It's like a very practical question.
No, if it happens outside of EU, honestly, I don't know. Yeah, going back to the previous question, I think that in this moment there is still only a difference of terminology between the PIA and the DPIA. Mm-hmm. I heard some arguing on this topic, also because the concept of data protection is narrow to what privacy includes, but so far I don't see any distinction. But definitely, probably in the next years, this will be more focused, because with the GDPR becoming mandatory, we will see more and more best practices. We'll see more and more DPAs published and the summaries of them. So I think this distinction will be made.
Thank you.
Yeah, on involving the rights and freedoms of the data subjects, I do think this is not only for Europe, but for all those countries where privacy and data protection are fundamental rights. And of course, we know that in North America, they are more regarded as consumer rights. So also there you do see a distinction in the scope of the assessment.
Yes.
Hi, I have a question about data privacy impact assessments for existing processing operations. We've obviously all read the guidance from the Article 29, but at least to me personally, it's still unclear whether where a processing has not been already checked by the DPA under Article, I don't know exactly what number it is from the directive, if it does pose a high risk, whether we need to perform a DPIA or not. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the confusion, and so basically, as you said, if the processing has been authorized, you shouldn't consult us if the risk is still the same. But if it's not the case, and if the processing presents a high risk, then a DPIA should be conducted.
So my question relates to a question that wasn't really addressed in this panel, at least that I heard, about public disclosure of DPIAs. And generally the response that I heard to will you disclose DPIAs publicly was no, just high-level descriptions of them. But on a panel yesterday about subject access rights, I actually heard somebody talk about strategic FOIA, Freedom of Information law litigation, where the suggestion was that they would approach DPAs in various member states under Freedom of Information laws and request DPIAs in full. So my related question is, both from the perspective of the businesses, how does that affect your potential disclosure in DPIAs to DPAs? And from the perspective of the government agents, is there going to be effort to basically educate your DPAs about the scope of trade secrecy requirements so that you can prepare for said Freedom of Information Act requests?
So we have an application of confidentiality, all the staff members, and we already receive trade secrets and confidential information. And at least to my knowledge, at the Belgian DPIA, there hasn't been any complaint so far. So it's not something that's really new.
Okay, some last questions.
My question is on the volume of DPIAs you think will come into DPAs. My experience is, I'm sorry, Sam Feifel at the IAPP, that DPAs are generally sort of understaffed already, and this is a significant new obligation. You got the 8 weeks on the consultation. How understaffed do you think certain member states will be, and do you think there's capacity at the DPAs to handle the volume that will come in?
Well, I think that is another reason why I don't believe in Article 36. Because indeed also the staffing and the experience of the staff at DPAs, with a lot of loose staff being hired and trained at the moment, that will also have an impact in meeting those deadlines. We've heard earlier this week multiple DPAs in sessions claim that also DPAs are not fully ready yet for GDPR. Also that they are struggling in dealing with the timelines and the very strict timelines in the GDPR, and that will also apply for DPIA reviews. Of course, there is no general obligation to send your DPIA to the regulators, and I wouldn't encourage anybody to do that because it's just a waste of time and effort. But because the DPAs won't do anything with them unless they have to do the assessment in case of remaining risk. So if your DPIA is perfectly fine and doesn't show any remaining risk, then why would you send it to the DPA? What would be the added value of that? That is the waste of time and effort I was referring to. So I don't think that many organizations at the outset will be sending a lot of DPIAs to be verified.
Okay, thank you. It was a good discussion. It has been, I think, in 2011 when I first was on a panel here at Cpdp on privacy impact assessment, which was a very exotic topic back then. Nevertheless, I heard something like an ignition for this very practical tool of the DPIA to become something more than just a tedious exercise Though, of course, we're a very special audience here, and maybe company representatives still think it's tedious. But nevertheless, there is some hope to turn DPIA into something really useful in various respects beyond compliance as the basis for accountability, for privacy by design, and other very important issues that are in the GDPR. And but it was quite obvious as well that there are many very special questions that still have to be sorted out, and processes to be tried out in practice. And I'm pretty sure that we will talk about DPIA next year and the year after next year at Cpdp again. So thank you for being here. Thank you for the panelists for their contribution. Thank you for asking the questions. And well, have a good lunch.